Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Rebecca Nagle and Professor Bryan Brayboy. Thanks for joining us. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of over 350 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for some introductions. Rebecca Nagle is an Oklahoma-based award-winning journalist and a citizen of Cherokee Nation. She is the writer and host of the podcast This Land. Her writing on Native representation, federal Indian law, and tribal sovereignty has been featured in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The Guardian, USA Today, Indian Country Today, and other publications. She's a Peabody Award nominee and the recipient of the American Mosaic Journalism Prize, the Women's Media Center's Exceptional Journalism Award, and numerous honors from the Native American Journalist Association. She's joined tonight by Bryan McKinley Jones Brayboy, Dean of Northwestern University's School of Education Social Policy, which is a FAN partner, and the Carlos Montezuma Professor of Education and Social Policy. He is a citizen of the Lumbee Nation, a member of the National Academy of Education and a fellow of the American Educational Research Association. Dean Brayboy's research focuses on intersecting knowledge systems that illuminate the ways that institutional structures simultaneously hinder and enable the success of underserved students, staff, and faculty. His research also explores the ways that culture and cultural practices mediate and support Indigenous student learning, community self-determination, and tribal nation building. It's an honor now to welcome Rebecca Nagle and Bryan Brayboy to FAN.
Thank you, Lonnie, and thank you, Anne Marie, and thank you all for joining us. Good evening, Rebecca.
Good evening. I'm so excited to be in conversation with you.
Likewise. How are you doing?
I'm feeling pretty good today. Feeling pretty good. Can't complain. We've had beautiful weather here in Oklahoma. It's been unseasonably warm, but really pretty outside.
Great. Well, I want to start by congratulating you on being longlisted for the Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction for this lovely, lovely book. And I'm wondering how you're feeling. Physically, how are you feeling? How's your health?
Oh, thanks for asking. Yeah, I know I've been really public about having long COVID, and I had a version of long COVID that is really had a lot of headaches, almost kind of like I had a bad concussion. And so, I mean, I'm a little tired right now, I won't lie. I had like 3 doctor's appointments today, but my headache the past few months has been a lot better. And so, yeah, my symptoms have like improved a lot the past few months. I'm hoping that trajectory, although it's been very slow, continues in that direction.
Great. Well, I'm certainly hoping you will be continue to be on the mend and quickly. I want to ask you, just as a starting point, can you tell us about the title of your book?
Yeah, so the title of the book is By the Fire We Cary, and it's inspired by a Joy Harjo poem called Returning from the Enemy. And the line from the poem is, I keep warm by the fire carried through cruelty. And I really struggled to name my book. There were a lot of different names, and the name also kind of came at the last minute when the publisher was like, we need a title, as in like 2 weeks ago, you got to get us this title. And so I read a lot of Joy Harjo poetry anyways, but I was sort of, I had already been thinking about themes of fire, and I had even already like the word Cary had come up in these like big brainstorms. And then I read that line in a Joy Harjo poem, and I was like, oh my goodness, because I was trying to find a title that really showed the expanse of time that the book covers, and this idea of an ongoing struggle. And so, you know, the fire that Joy is talking about in her poem is, you know, our literal ceremonial fires for those of us from Southeastern nations. our fires is one of the things that, help is part of, when we say one fire, our shared fires is part of what made us Cherokee or what made us Muscogee. And then during removal and during our forced removal, we brought those fires to Oklahoma, where they still burn today. So it's keeping care of the literal fire, but then for me it was also symbolic, fire as in the fight for tribal sovereignty and the fight for justice. And so so that's all. And then the other story, so I had a version, I was like still working on the title, and it was Cary, past tense, like the poem. And my friend Joseph Cloud and I was talking about it, and he kind of challenged me and said, well, why is this past tense? Because this is something, we're still doing this work, as Indigenous people here in Eastern Oklahoma, we're still taking care of these things. And so that was how it became Cary.
Awesome. Thank you. We're going to come back to this notion of time, because I agree. It's really critically important to this really rhetorically beautiful book that you've written. Tell us what the book is about.
Yeah, so the book is about a Supreme Court case that resulted in the largest restoration of tribal land in U.S. history, McGirt v. Oklahoma. But that case started in a surprising place. It actually started as a murder in 1999, and a man named Patrick Murphy murdered a fellow Muscogee citizen named George Jacobs, and Patrick was sentenced to death. And it was actually in the course of his death penalty appeals that his lawyer came up with this argument that Oklahoma didn't have jurisdiction to prosecute Patrick, let alone execute him, because the crime had actually happened on his tribe's reservation. Oklahoma argued that reservation no longer existed. It hadn't existed in over 100 years. It was absurd for the tribe to be saying that it exists now. And that question went all the way to the Supreme Court. And I think we'll probably get to this theme, but really what the case was about, the law was clearly on Muscogee Nation's side. It was very clearly on the tribe's side. And the question was, is the Supreme Court going to follow the law, or is the Supreme Court, as so often happens when it comes to tribal sovereignty and the legal rights of tribes, is the court going to bend or break the rules to appease non-natives? And the book, it goes back and forth in time. So the spine of the book is covering the case from the original crime all the way up to the Supreme Court decision. But then every other chapter is back in history. And so the book also tells the story of our tribe's forced removal from our homelands in the Southeast onto land that would later become Oklahoma, and then the creation of Oklahoma on top of those treaty territories.
So I want to thank you for that. I want to go back to the legal vehicle, in which this is fundamentally a case about jurisdiction. And you note in the text itself that young Indian kids learn, the first three words they should learn are mama, papa, and jurisdiction. Say more about that.
Yeah. And that's a quote from a lawyer who worked on the case in its early days, a woman named Sharon Blackwell. She said that while I was interviewing her, and I was just like, wow, it's such a great way to put it. But yeah, so Patrick Murphy had been on death row for about 4 years when he was assigned a federal public defender. And the federal public defender is in charge of sort of the last thing between death row inmates and the execution chamber, and that's a federal habeas petition. And so this is typically people's last appeal, though, obviously lots of stuff happens in death penalty appeals. And so this lawyer sort of was investigating the case from the ground up, sort of not taking any of the facts of the case for granted. And she was actually out in the field interviewing a police officer who had found the murder weapon, he was actually a tribal police officer, speaking of jurisdiction. And she was going to go down to the location of the crime just to see it for herself. And this police officer told her that the location she had on her map, which was what Oklahoma had recorded as where the crime happened, was wrong. And she said, huh? And so she drove down the road and she came to the place that was marked on her map and she didn't see anything. And then she got to the place where this police officer told her to look, and she found a roadside memorial to the murder victim, a man named George Jacobs, that had been placed there by his family. And she realized that OSBI, which is the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigations, had recorded the wrong location of the crime. And this got the defense team thinking, because jurisdiction has geographical boundaries, right? So like a prosecutor from Philadelphia can't go prosecute people who committed crimes in New York. And in Oklahoma, prior to the McGirt decision, we had a checkerboard of jurisdiction, because at that time, that was how tribal land worked. And so they started digging into the land and thinking about it. And as they did, I think with the help of a Muscogee and Omaha lawyer, that woman, Sherry Blackwell, they started to realize, hey, wait a minute, it's not just this one little area of the land that's tribal land. The whole entire Muscogee reservation was never disestablished by Congress. And even though the state doesn't recognize it, according to the law and according to these treaties and according to the Supreme Court precedent that interprets all those things, this reservation still exists. And so that was sort of how you got from a murder to this big argument. And it would actually, so that they came up with that argument in like 2004, 2005, and it would take another 15 years for the Supreme Court to actually rule on the issue. So it took a really long time for it to meander its way all the way to the Supreme Court.
So part of the point, and so Murphy ends up in a 4-4 vote, because one of the justices has to recuse himself because he was sitting on the 10th Circuit at the time. And then it gets taken up under another name. They were waiting for another case. And this is where the McGirt case, which is the big case, comes out of. And McGirt is in serving a life sentence because he had abused his 3-year-old step-granddaughter in really powerful ways. And I think part of the power of what you get here by weaving such a beautiful narrative is that this really important jurisdictional case ends up starting through really a pretty heinous and brutal murder, enough to get the death penalty. And then it continues through really unfortunate circumstances around the abuse of this young girl. And so I wonder if you might just, there's a really powerful moment in the book where you're engaged with Chief Floyd, and he essentially says we can't choose the vehicle through which these things happen. I wonder if you might just talk about just the fact that this starts out in fairly heinous ways, but ends up in a really powerful result at the end.
Yeah, and I think for me, it was an important theme for the book, because I think sometimes we want our histories to be clean and we want our stories to be neat in a way that I just think that the world doesn't work that way. Like, we want good things to always come from good places. Yeah, I mean, and I think that one of the key tensions of this case, and one of the things I really felt and thought a lot about as I wrote it, and I'm glad that it came through, because it was really important to me that it came through, was just the tension of, this Supreme Court victory was such a victory for so many tribal citizens, but for the families that were affected by these crimes, having these cases reopened and go all the way to the Supreme Court was a real hardship. And reopened old wounds and old trauma that people thought, they had a conviction and these cases were settled. And so, and I think that this case isn't unique. When you look at a lot of the big cases in federal Indian law, I mean, going all the way back to Crow Dog, they start with these crimes, and a lot of the fights over jurisdiction and tribal land, and really, what power do tribes have versus what power do states have? A lot of these have been fought in cases that originate with a crime. And, you know, in that section where I was talking with Chief Floyd, you know, by the time the case was going to the appeals court, that was one step below the Supreme Court, you know, he didn't get to decide how the case that was going to answer the question of whether or not his tribe still had a reservation. He didn't get to decide where that came from. The only choice for him as a tribal leader was, okay, are we going to let these courts decide this issue without us, or are we going to get involved? And I think that's not unique, right? I think that's not unique to this case. And one of the ways that the doctrines work in federal Indian law is that because we have this, you know, domestic dependent, like semi-sovereign subordinate nation status under the law in the United States, it makes it harder for tribes to bring litigation on their own behalf. And so in this weird, twisted way, it's easier for a man on death row to make this argument about the reservation legally than it is the tribe. And so that's just part of the nature, and I would say one of the problems of how federal Indian law works. And but I think a really important part of the complexity of this story, and you know, one of the things I thought about a lot in writing this book is that I hope that we're still talking about McGirt 20 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now as a really important Supreme Court case. And I wanted there to be a place where the entire story of the case and how it came to be was well documented, because it is, you know, it is people believing in it and fighting for it, and really some Native lawyers very early on, when everyone else is like, this heinous murder case is not gonna, you know, undo 100 years of wrong-headed assumptions in Oklahoma, and a few Native lawyers really believing in it. But it's also happenstance, you know, it also came through all of these circumstances that just collided. And I wanted that to be well documented and preserved, for people to be able to look back on it and just know how it happened.
Yeah. Thanks. We're going to dig into that in a second, but I want to just reiterate a point I think you've made. So there are American Indian Laws Code 25 in the legal system, and I think the need for crimes to happen in order for forward things, good things to happen is just such a, for me, feels like a unique aspect of American Indian law, this particular code of law, and gets at the complicated relationship between tribal nations and the U.S. government. And I think you do a great job of, to your point about wanting to tell this whole story. Tell us a bit about your method. My sense is you're an investigative journalist, given the way that you've written about this. You also strike me as someone who's a pretty powerful historian and genealogist. We'll come back to that in a moment, but talk about your method in terms of laying out this whole story, which for me is a fascinating, the twists and turns in this are fascinating.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a completist. And so where I started was, you know, wanting to get my hands on every piece of paper that had been filed in the Murphy and McGirt cases. And as you can imagine, with 20 years of litigation, it was a lot of paperwork. You know, most of those records weren't too hard to get. You know, I had to like track down, you know, the court reporter from 20 years ago. Shout out Trixie Ingram. She actually like delivered the like boxes of court transcripts to my house because it was like too much to mail. And so, you know, I went through the court transcripts. I went through all of the appeals from the Oklahoma level, and then from Pacer downloaded all of the federal appeals. And then also just went out and interviewed people. So, you know, I interviewed Patrick Murphy, the defendant, community members, his cousins, you know, some of the police, the original investigators who were there on the scene, the public defenders who worked on the case early on. You know, I even talked to, like, one of the most interesting conversations I had was Patrick was baptized while he was in jail awaiting trial, and I interviewed the pastor that baptized him. And so really just trying to, you know, talk to tribal leaders, talk to the attorneys who sort of, you know, there's sort of these waves of the story and the case, the attorneys that worked on the case once it was at a higher level. And so one of the big things I do is just get a ton of documents together and go through the documents and learn, and then also to just I wanted to put the reader very close to the case so they felt like they were going through the case as it moved through these different stages, and that interviewing the lawyers who worked on that was really, really helpful, and the tribal leaders at Muscogee Nation who were making some of those critical decisions. So that was for the case. And then there were things, we filed open records requests in Oklahoma, actually had to work with the Reporters Committee for Free Press to sue the governor and the attorney general when they didn't comply. We collected a ton of data from district attorneys, from the Oklahoma Department of Corrections. So I know we're going to talk later a little bit about Oklahoma's false claims, but, really worked to get documents, some that are easy to get and are publicly available, and other ones that we had to file a lawsuit to get.
Yeah. So I'm going to, you have this sentence at the end of your introduction. You say, and selfishly, I wrote this book because the story lived in my body and I needed it to come out. Prior to that, you talk about going to Andrew Jackson's childhood home and spitting on his grave when you think no one is looking. But then you take us through and you weave this story about your own relatives and really beautifully link it to what happens with Murphy and then McGirt. So talk about, if you don't mind, just tell us about how that came to be and your processes for that as well.
Yeah, I think from the first time I heard about the Murphy case and I thought about this possibility that our reservations here in eastern Oklahoma could be affirmed and recognized for the first time in over 100 years, I felt this visceral sense of justice. And for me, it was very connected to the sacrifice that my ancestors made. I was told and raised to believe by my grandma, by my aunts, by my dad, that my ancestors, the Ridges, had died for the sake of Cherokee Nation, and had sacrificed their lives for our tribe. And this land, that Oklahoma wasn't recognizing as Cherokee land, was part of that sacrifice. I think what I got to do in the book was, as a journalist and as an adult, examine the historical record and put that together against my childhood understanding. And I think, just like we talked about with the crime and the evolution, it's complicated. It was very complicated. But I think that I read a lot of history books about removal and the period of time that the book covers, and I think that a lot of non-native historians have books that are full of the facts and the figures and like the truth of what happened, but somehow can't write to the totality of it and the totality of the loss that our tribes and our families experienced. And I think, and it's not to defend the Ridges, and I think I come down in a pretty complicated way, but I still think that in the tragedy of their story, there's a way that you can understand the tragedy of what happened to Cherokee Nation and our tribes in the Southeast. And I think that there's actually a lot to learn in that perspective. And I feel like I learned a lot of just the hopelessness and their desperation that they made, the decision to sign that treaty from.
So your ancestors are John and Major Ridge. They end up being assassinated for their role in a treaty that ends up giving up some lands and a movement. And you end up saying in the book itself, like you feel like it was necessary that this happened because of the circumstances. So I thought it was just for me, there's a gut punch in the way in which you write that, not because I disagree with you, but because of the just the honesty of your assessment. Frankly, throughout the book, it's a this book is many things. One of the more powerful pieces of it is the courage with which you write about very complicated things like that, and freedom and other things, which I hope we'll come back to. For those listening, part of what you should know is in the 18 teens, and into the 1820s, there are these three really important cases, often called the Marshall Trilogy, that Rebecca's talking about, which then they're contradictory. They lead to some confusion, and Jackson comes along. Part of the reason why I assume you're spitting on Jackson's grave is he comes along, he ignores the Supreme Court and carries out removal, which is really taking um, indigenous peoples, five tribes primarily, and moves them forcefully to Oklahoma, which is where they are. There are still tribes in the southeast, but they're also in Oklahoma. And it's a fairly brutal regime. I mean, fairly is the wrong word. It is a brutal regime and
Yeah.
use of military power, but also turning natives against one another who participate in their own removal. So that's the removal that you're getting at. Do you want to say anything more about that before we?
Yeah. So by the 1830s, and it was really driven by the South, but with Jackson as their chief ally in the White House, but Southern states really coveted indigenous land, and the indigenous nations there were refusing to go. And so the South came up with this strategy of we will terrorize and harass, then basically make it unbearable for the indigenous people to stay. And if we do that well enough and hard enough, they'll agree to leave. And Cherokee Nation won a case at the Supreme Court called Worcester v. Georgia, where the Supreme Court told Georgia that it had to stop, basically, that it had passed all these harassment laws and was doing all these things, arresting Cherokee citizens on Cherokee land. And the Supreme Court said Cherokee is a sovereign nation and Georgia doesn't have jurisdiction on Cherokee land. So going back to jurisdiction. But then Andrew Jackson decided to ignore the Supreme Court decision. And that was when my ancestors, decided that they didn't think that there was a better option for Cherokees, that basically, they thought that for Cherokees to survive as a nation and as a people, that we had to go west. And so, and for that they were eventually assassinated for that betrayal. And what followed the Treaty of New Echota that my ancestors signed was the Trail of Tears. And so because Cherokees had not agreed to remove, the deadline set by the treaty came, and 7,000 U.S. soldiers and militiamen went out into the hills and the valleys of Cherokee Nation and at gunpoint herded people into open air stockades. And then from those open air stockades, herded people to the main concentration camps where people were kept without shelter, without sanitation, and people died. The estimates from one missionary that 2,000 people died in just a few months. And then people marched west, and people estimate, or one missionary estimates, that between the roundup and removal, a quarter of the Cherokee population died. And so you see similar population loss with the Choctaws, with the Seminoles, and with the Muscogee. The Chickasaws had less death on their removal, but still also had to move, or called the Five Tribes. And so that was, that removal was Jackson's signature policy. And, what happened, I mean, it's hard to fathom the amount of loss and the loss of life that our ancestors saw and experienced, also while they were going through the heartbreak of the loss of our ancestral homelands.
Thanks for that. I want to, in lots of ways, this book is about land and greed. and a quest for it. Even removal, the way that you've just really so eloquently laid out. Southerners have a labor force in slaves. They have land that they want to put to use. Um, but it's not, for me, it's not just land. And I mean, I think about land, place, the relationship between land, place, and property. And here's what I mean by that. I wonder if you can just be interested in your response to this vis-a-vis your book. But land is is physical space. Place is land that has been imbued with meaning by people. And so it becomes something different than just physical space. It is where we are tied spiritually. It's where our ancestors are buried. It's where our belief systems are located. It means something different to us. There's a tension between place and property. And property really is about ownership. And what happens when we take place that is communally owned and has communal meanings and we turn it into individual property is really at feels to me like the tensions between those things are in lots of ways at the heart of this, connected with larger questions of greed. And I wonder whether or not that feels right to you and what you want to push back on and elaborate on or help us think about differently.
Yeah, I mean, I think sadly, Indigenous rights have been governed by greed. I think more than we want to admit. I think our history has been governed by greed in this country more than what we want to admit. And so often, when tribes have had these devastating losses for our tribes, whether it was the losses brought about by removal or the losses that were brought about by allotment, it's because greedy people wanted more, and for removal, a lot of it had to do with more land for cotton production and the slave economy. With allotment, it was, non-native settlers that had come into Indian territory and were actually illegally squatting on our lands, and wanted that opened up. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that, and I think the other important perspective within that is that oftentimes when we talk about what Indigenous nations lost, we talk about land. But that's just what white people gained, because what our tribes lost in losing our land is actually so much more, because land, language, culture, and sovereignty, they're all connected, and you can't piece and you can't pull them apart. And so whenever we lost land, what you see happen is also culture and language and sovereignty suffer. And I think on the flip side of that is where, where we have managed to hold on to our land is often the places where, tribes are still exercising their sovereignty, where you still see tribal governments, and where you still see culture being practiced and languages being spoken. And so I think that those things are really inextricable for Indigenous people. And when we talk about land and the importance of land, there's so much more that goes into that.
So the five tribes are pushed off of their lands by force. They end up in Oklahoma and they find oil and gas. And there's more of the same. You weave this incredible story about a young woman who inherits this land that is filled with oil and gas, and you kind of take us through this heartbreaking story of what happens to her. You want to say you want to talk about this a bit more? So you get
Yeah.
one piece of land because it's valuable to a place that the federal government thought indigenous peoples would, the five tribes in particular, but there are 20 other tribes there that were removed during the same time. There more get added later to land that largely isn't seen as having a whole bunch of value. And then there's a twist.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So our tribes were removed to west of the Mississippi to an area that was at the time called Indian Territory. It would later become Oklahoma. And, that land was promised to us for as long as the grass grows and the water runs and peace and plenty. And that promise was not kept. And so in the late 1800s, the federal government through Congress came back, and Congress wanted our tribes to agree to this thing called allotment. And what allotment did was it took land. So we owned our land communally. So you could have a house, build a farm, and you owned the house, you owned the farm, but the tribe owned the land underneath. There wasn't any private land property within the 5 tribes. And what allotment did was take the land, slice it all up, and divide and assign it to an individual citizen. So instead of the tribe owning the land communally, each tribal citizen owned a chunk of land. And what happened during allotment is that settlers who wanted that land were willing to do basically anything to get it. So, they would send out bilingual tribal citizens who would lie. They would forge documents. They would try to get people to leave them their land and their will. And all of a sudden, there were all of these unexplained deaths. Courts would assign guardians to children. So instead of parents controlling the children's estates, court appointed guardians would control the children's estates, and the guardians would basically just rob the children's estates. And where these crimes were most egregious were for the people who were unfortunate enough for their land to contain oil. And one of those people was a Muscogee woman named Millie Naharkey. So she was actually a baby when allotment happened, and her father died, and we don't know why. And he actually died right after his wife and his mother died. So kind of a line of her family passes away. She's a baby, and she inherits a bunch of her father's land, and she is a kid with this oil-rich land. And an oil developer wants to get her land the moment she turns 18. And so a few weeks before her 18th birthday, he conspires with her half-brother to abduct Millie, take her out of state, and kind of basically try to trick her into signing away her land. And while she's abducted, she's also sexually assaulted. She comes back to Oklahoma. She's found. The BIA finds her. And there's supposed to be this sort of moment of justice, right? That, this evil sort of oil prospector abducted her, and the government is going to come in and protect Millie. No one's ever held accountable for the abduction. But instead of protection, what Millie gets is she's declared legally incompetent, and she's assigned a guardian, which was extremely common in Oklahoma at the time for Native people who had valuable allotments. Millie Naharkey died in 1996, and she had a legal guardian until she died. And so I went through her probate files, and I saw where she had to ask her guardian permission to buy sheets, to buy towels, to buy a garbage disposal, for money to travel to visit a sick relative that was living in another state, for money to file for divorce, which also she couldn't file for herself because she was declared legally incompetent, money for medical bills, for dentures, to pay her taxes. And so she was saddled. I think her life story really shows, she was sort of followed from the cradle to the grave by allotment, and just all the different ways. I think we have this idea of the American dream and like how capitalism is supposed to work in the country. And I think what you can see in stories like Millie's, and really in allotment in general, is there was this moment where Native people in Oklahoma had a lot of wealth, like the most productive oil fields in the world were owned by Native people in Oklahoma, and all that wealth was, almost all of that wealth was stolen.
Yeah, so I've kind of lingered in the past for a reason with you. You've pulled it into 1996 when Millie passes away. Let's return to Murphy and McGirt to kind of bring us into the moment. And for me, lingering in the past is critically important to understand because of how we ended up where we are now in 2024. And so Murphy is a 4-4 um, case. And then McGirt comes along and talk about, can you just sort of run us through these two cases um, in the case? And
Yeah, absolutely. So, we don't know for sure, but I think like everyone kind of assumes, and I think it's very safe to say that the justices were stuck in a 4-4 tie and couldn't make a ruling in Murphy because Justice Gorsuch had to recuse himself. And they could have just upheld the lower court's ruling, but it seemed like they wanted to write their own decision. And so when Patrick Murphy won at the 10th Circuit, which is a step below the Supreme Court, a group of jailhouse lawyers at the James Crabtree Correctional Center in Helena, Oklahoma, got together and they said, you know what, we're Native. Our crimes happened on reservations. They couldn't prosecute this guy. Maybe they couldn't prosecute us. And one of those inmates was a man named Jim C. McGirt, who was serving a life sentence and also like 500 years for sexually abusing his wife's 3-year-old granddaughter. And he was basically going to spend the rest of his life in prison. And so he filed a bunch of appeals. He actually filed them wrong, and the courts told him. And so then he came back and he filed the right kind of appeals, and he lost in the trial court. He lost in the Oklahoma Criminal Court of Appeals. And then he appealed that without a lawyer to the Supreme Court. You can see his petition. It literally has like sort of handwritten notes between the lines. And the Supreme Court granted cert because they wanted a case where Gorsuch wouldn't be recused and where it was still about the Muscogee Reservation. And McGirt was the only case that made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And so I think it caught a lot of people off guard because, in June, we're waiting for the decision to come down. There's this no decision announcement. We're all shocked, like, wait, what happened? And then, you're waiting to hear when the Supreme Court, they release these calendars and you're waiting to hear, okay, when is it going to be on the calendar? When is it going to be on the calendar? And it's not, and then it's not. And then this McGirt case came out of nowhere. And so that's sort of how the two cases work together. I think that, it's kind of confusing, but it's sort of a twist and a turn that not a lot of people expected.
so the court finds in favor of McGirt, and I wonder if you'll just read a small piece of your book. And if you all have the book, I'm reading. It's from the chapter called "The Victory," and I'm asking Rebecca to read the bottom of 178 to the top of 179. It begins after 20 years, and I wonder if you might read that for us.
Yeah. After 20 years, 19 appeals, and 2 Supreme Court cases, the reservation of Muscogee Nation was affirmed. It is important to stop here in the moment and to recognize all that it has taken to arrive at this act of justice. There was the resolve, struggle, and battle, the food cooked to help those working long hours. There were those who picked up who took care of the children, wrote Muskogee citizen and U.S. Poet Laureate Joy Harjo. Those who kept walking the long distance of heartbreak to arrive at a reservation and to start all over again. And at last, on the far end of the trail of tears, a promise has been kept.
Yeah, so and I'm about to start crying again. I was so filled with emotion with the way in which you talked about this, because I think what Harjo does in this and your where you've led us to in terms of just understanding that this was not a singular heroic effort. Even its origins are messy, and then we end up here. But I think Of course, there's never sort of a clean ending in a happy story because Oklahoma starts working to overturn and challenge McGirt. But I want to, in our last, I think we've got maybe 10 or 12 minutes left, and there are some Q&As, a couple of Q&As that we may be able to get to. But I wonder about, I have a couple of questions for you. I think throughout this book, there are these larger questions around the role of lies and myths. Um, and you really take us into the courtroom about what lawyers um, for Oklahoma are saying. On page 214, you say to avoid calling it greed, lies are told. The land belonged to Georgia. You go on to say illegal squatters in Indian Territory deserved property rights. There were never reservations in Oklahoma, and on and on and on. I wonder if you might talk to us about those and why they're so important in this story.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something I find as a Native person, I feel like I see it. I feel like every battle for tribal sovereignty and every battle for justice for tribes is a battle over the truth. And I think that because people know so little about us, that you can kind of say whatever you want about Native people and people will believe it. And so when you look at, and it's kind of remarkable because we think, okay, removal, like Southern lawmakers, they just wanted the land. And so they just said, hey, we just want this land. We don't like Indigenous people, get rid of them. But when you read the congressional debate, what they're standing up there and saying is that moving west is best for these Indigenous people. They're corrupted by living too close to white people. They can't handle it. They need to move west. We tried to civilize them, it didn't work. Their best bet is to move west. And then you see the same thing with allotment. It's even stronger with allotment, even though tribal citizens are saying, we don't want this. Tribal leaders are saying, we don't want this. Congressional leaders come in and say, well, we really want Native people to become part of the broader society. We want to make them better at capitalism. And so they need to own private property to become, sort of self-serving capitalists. And then there were also these lies told about crime that, the reservations back, this is the early 1900s, were sort of these like lawless places where it's sort of trained, there's this one quote I use in the book where it's like it has become the haven of trained robbers and assassins and murderers. And so you see these lies told all the time to sort of justify the taking of tribal sovereignty and the taking of tribal land. And then you come up to the present moment with McGirt and then the fight that Oklahoma launched to undo McGirt right after it was decided. And both during the court case and right after, Oklahoma used this lie of crime. And so they said before the case was decided, if the reservations are affirmed, the jailhouse doors are going to fling open. It's going to be, there's going to be like blood in the streets. It's going to be chaos. Thousands of criminals will be set free. And then they kept, sort of, after that didn't come true, they had to kind of rehash and update the lie. But they sort of kept like pushing this lie of, lawlessness and chaos on the reservation. And so, I think that is how one of the ways that American colonization works, that instead of just naming the greed and naming the illegality of what people are doing, because often it's actually is illegal, naming their position, people come up with these lies about Indigenous nations to justify what they want to take. And I think that's a really important, we have this moment where we're talking about disinformation and lies and how is it spreading so easily. And as an Indigenous person, I'm like, this is always been a part of our government. And like the powerful in our country have always lied. And I think it's also just like, it's essentially how oppression works. Like the oppressors are never like, we are here to oppress. That is not their position. Their position is what we are doing is correct. And in order to justify what is fundamentally unjust, you have to bend the truth to your reality. And I think that Indigenous people have been victim to that, I think, to a greater extent than the public even understands. And for me, that is why I am so passionate about journalism and doing these big dives and getting it all recorded, because I think that, I think that we're still in this fight over the truth, for tribal sovereignty.
Yeah, thank you. I think for me, the danger isn't in the first lie, it's in the second and the third, so that when lies become truth. And you do a really beautiful job of pointing to the ways in which the state of Oklahoma just keeps repeating itself so much that it becomes a truth, in the midst of all of this. So we're your next, not your penultimate, but your next to penultimate book talk about this. Is there a question out there that you haven't been asked that you wish someone had asked you about your book?
Oh man, I know. Oh, man, I'm trying to think.
Let me ask you, Sarah. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead.
I was going to say, is there a question you wish I had asked that I didn't ask?
I mean, one of the things that we didn't touch on that that I would like to talk about is some of the aftermath. So one of the things I get asked a lot, which isn't like, I guess maybe the opposite, but I get asked a lot about what were the practical consequences. So once the reservations were affirmed, what happened? I get asked that a lot. And I think that a lot of people have the perspective that reservations come with more power than they do. And so tribes have very limited criminal jurisdiction over non-native people who commit crimes on our land. And we also have very limited civil jurisdiction over non-natives on what's called fee land, which it's complicated, but don't worry about it. Fee land is over 90%, 95% of our reservations in eastern Oklahoma. And so basically, if you're non-native, the tribe can't do that much. So like the tribes aren't coming in and like seizing people's private property. Far from it. They're not even saying, hey, you need a permit to operate that business. They don't even have the authority to do that under current US law. So what did shift was who prosecutes crimes when those crimes are committed by native people. And Oklahoma tried to say first that thousands, then tens of thousands, up to 76,000 past convictions would get thrown out because of this jurisdictional claim. And they were trying to say that was like all the people that they had prosecuted that now they want to have jurisdiction over. So I got the numbers from the Oklahoma Department of Corrections, and with a fellow reporter named Alison Herrera, we like crunched them all down. And about 200 people had a little, I think it was maybe around 250, I'd have to look back, but over 200 people had their state conviction vacated, but most of those people were retried by the feds or by the tribes, and only 68 people were just straight out released from prison. 68. So we went from 76,000 to 68. So literally one 10,000th of the estimate came true. And then Oklahoma tried to make similar claims about cases going unprosecuted, and those were similarly exaggerated. And so that was one of the big lies that was told after the court decision, and I think a misconception that a lot of people have about the case.
Great, thanks. Just quickly, there are two really lovely questions in the Q&A. I'm going to pass on one of them because I think it's going to take a long time to answer, but I wonder, there's a question from Bruce Delahorn who's asking, as a former Tulsa-born resident, does the Muscogee reservation include Tulsa?
Yeah, absolutely. So Tulsa is actually split. So Osage Nation, Cherokee Nation, and Muscogee Nation all kind of meet in Tulsa. So, but if you know Tulsa well, through McGirt, the reservation of Muscogee Nation was affirmed, and then later the reservations of all 5 tribes, including Cherokee Nation, were affirmed. And Cherokee Nation's kind of like north of like 412, kind of, and then 412, and then Muscogee Nation is most of Tulsa. So so Tulsa is on reservation land now.
Yeah. So Lonnie's coming back on, but I just want to say to you, this book is extraordinary. It's lovely. It's beautifully written. It deserves all of the acclamation and awards and affirmation it's getting. I do want to congratulate you on writing something that's a compelling story, but is also just a wonderful teaching tool. So thank you. And thanks for being in conversation with me.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was great.
Bryan, thank you so much for a very thoughtful, careful, very aware of the audience listening who may or may not have had a chance to read the book yet. We really appreciate your service to the fan community. You're a great partner. CESP is a great partner to fan, and you're just excellent in this role in being able to interview Rebecca about her incredible book. I second that. We'll be crossing our fingers for the Carnegie announcement tomorrow. We'll be hoping to see you as a finalist there. Is it just the finalists being announced, or is the actual winners being announced, do you think?
I think it's just the finalists.
Okay, good. Well, we're going to cross fingers on that. So I want to remind folks, we've been posting in chat. We are going to be doing another a Zoom right after this one that we call After Hours. It's going to start at 8:05 p.m. Central. We'll give Bryan and Rebecca a 5-minute break in between their Zooms. They will be in that room. You can join by buying a copy of Rebecca's book from the bookstall. As I mentioned, we've been putting the link in chat here. Buy a copy, come hang out, ask your own questions. There's plenty more to learn. I'm sure Bryan will say we've only started scratching the surface. Lots more to talk about. And, obviously you have these 2 very brilliant people between you, the 2 of you. I can't even, the collective wisdom and knowledge is kind of overwhelming. Come ask your questions, come hang out. What an incredible opportunity to spend more time. There was one quick question. We got maybe 2 minutes, Rebecca, so you're not going to barely be able to give a full answer. There's a question that was submitted in advance that I think and was actually echoed by someone else in advance, kind of 2 similar question from both people. It's from Christopher in Chicago, and he asked, for individuals and communities interested in being in allyship with Native Americans and First Nations peoples, what is the most important thing or things we can do to be of support? So if you had a couple things that you might suggest, and Bryan, maybe at After Hours, you can chime in on that as well. I'm sure you probably also have some thoughts on that, I would imagine. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the most effective allies and the people who do work in Indian country in a way that is sustainable start with relationships, and start by building relationships. Whether that's with Native leaders in your area. I think, non-Native institutions that build strong relationships with tribes. And I think that's where we have the most success. I think it's hard when folks sort of show up and want things to happen quickly or happen fast. But I think when people are invested in those relationships and it's built over time, that's when we can really build with our non-Native allies.
Okay, I appreciate that. So we're right at 8 o'clock. I want to thank everybody for joining us. A reminder, we have another event tomorrow night with Tom McGrath, which is also going to take a very interesting take on just the more general topic of how did we get here. He's going to have some interesting things to say about that. Thank you so much, Rebecca. We'll see both you and Bryan in about 5 minutes. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Thanks so much.